afternoon. Today's special guest, Bhupesh Goyal. We were batchmates at Nalanda doing Masters in Buddhist Studies. Bhupesh was the winner, topped our batch. Today, we will be talking about Indian politics from about Gandhi's 47 era to today, looking more at modern Indian history, contemporary Indian politics, national and international, to kind of see maybe in the future, where is India going to go? What are our hopes? What are our concerns, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bhupesh, get us started. What do you think is the status quo of Indian politics? What's on your mind?
So thank you so much for having me here for the chat, Andre.
Hmm.
Uh, so it's a difficult question, I think, not very easy to answer because there are many factors to consider. But all in all, I think if you look at it in a comparative perspective, when you compare it with what it has been for the last about 100 years from now, I think the outlook is rather positive. It's more positive than it is negative. And that's how I look at it. Right now in India, there is a talk going on about the concept called Amrit Kal. That is the 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 period of the golden period, you can call it. So it's basically we have recently completed 75 years since we got independent from the British Empire, and now the present government imagines and aspires to make the coming 25 years plan and execute in a way so that India grows out of its present status of being a developing country and turn into a developed nation. So that's the ambition, that's the uh, goal, sort of, which the present government has set forth in front of it.
Are you that patriotically optimistic? India superpower by 2030? They always push back the timeline, right? In the 2010s, it was like superpower by 2020. Now they're pushing it again for 10 more years, superpower by 2030. So, where do you think those kinds of interpretations are going?
Yeah, well, I don't even uh, think that superpower in the typical sense of the term would be something that is so easy to going to be achieved. But I think we can appreciate, if we stand right now, how different uh, the trajectory of Indian economy, especially, has been since 1991, since the time we started to open our economy. So there has been a massive shift in the realities, especially of the middle class Indians. I can talk about my own parents. My father, when he got his first job in the 1980s, he started out, he used to get a salary of around 160 Indian rupees at that point of time, and currently he draws 1,000 times salary if you compare it. So of course, many things have changed. The inflation has grown, likewise, the cost of living has grown, likewise, but still, there has been a massive shift in the realities of the middle class, especially, and of course, the upper class. But the fact remains that when we talk about development in India, there is a huge proportion of the population which still lags behind. So, of course, there are two different ways of looking at what really would the term superpower mean. Would it mean the power being there in the hands of a select few, or will it be the power in the hands of masses or the poor people in general? So that's the difficult question. And currently, there are no strong signs. I won't say there are very strong signs that we can be sure that yes, we are going to have an equitable development. So I think there is a huge amount of work has to be done if one really wants to see India as a country where the masses share the growing wealth. But if you look at it from a purely GDP perspective, of course, the India stands right now currently at number five amongst the top GDPs in the world. So that way, there are some positives, but there are many challenges as well, I think. Yeah.
Mhm.
What do you think?
Oh, I mean, I totally agree that there's a problem of redistribution of wealth, and some places are lacking more behind than others. I mean, we lived in Bihar. We've seen what
Yep.
most drawback kind of places in India can be like, right? And it's interesting with the Bihari Maoists and whatever, because then we can get into discussions. Well, the Modi government tried to intervene and build infrastructure in Bihar and whatever
Yep.
else, and the Biharis kind of warded away the Modi administration and whatever else. Um, I think the ambition when the BJP types of people say India superpower or whatever else, I think they mean militarily and fiscally competitive, right? I think they mean that in a realist hard power kind of sense to diminish Pakistan's projections of Kashmir, to have some uh, powerful line of defense against the Chinese, to have more influence in South Asia, to become a regional hegemon, right? The East Asians have the Chinese, the Europeans have the Russian, so they want to be the next big thing as far as regional influence and whatever else. Although I think that's already more or less the case, right? I mean, almost all South Asian states look to India for guidance. They look up to India, so that's already somewhat there only. But I think it's interesting you mentioned the 91 kind of reforms, right? Because the Indian administration in 91 had two options, right? They invest in IT or they invest in agriculture per se. There,
Yeah.
there were some there were some heated debates about what is the most efficient way to grow India in the early 90s, right? And we know they opted for the IT route, and we saw the tech boom in India with the IITs, with the Mumbais and the Delhis, and all the jokes of people that didn't clear IIT Mumbai but got into MIT and Stanford and Georgetown and whatever else. I've met some of them myself here also. They I asked, why didn't you stay at IIT? No, because they couldn't clear it there, but they came here. So I mean, that speaks volumes to the high level of proficiency of a lot of hardworking studying Indian folks when it comes to IT and whatever else. But it came at a cost, right? Because when you invest in IT, you invest in a very specialized skill that
Yeah.
technology is the future and whatever else. Sure, bilkul, but there's also the problem of that affects the masses, right? That leaves a lot of, if they would have gone for the agricultural route, we would have likely seen less starvation problems, less developmental problems. Investment in agriculture comes with also technology. I think that's where the mistake was in the 90s, because there wasn't so much debates about the green energy and environmental technology or whatever else. If India would have chosen to go that way with all the manpower and resources India even had in the 90s, it could have been, at least my view is, it could have been a leader in environmental infrastructure and science. You can still train your IIT people, instead of doing computers, they can learn how to do better environmental technology or whatever else. I don't necessarily see why the 90s administrations took this as a either or kind of case. If they knew how to correctly invest in agriculture, it would have been for, I think, the greater good of like most of the people in India also. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And just to add to this part of the discussion, even the current leader of India, Narendra Modi, when he talks about development, I think the very often the first thing which he talks about is the first goal being to create a $5 trillion economy. So that's something of a phrase which is constantly repeated. We just hear it very often. So this is the sort of line of thought, if you want, that the present government thinks of development from a top-down of sort of approach, where you look, imagine, and you aspire and aim at things having GDP in your mind more than the ideas like social inclusion. Yeah.
I mean, what the Modi regime is doing is taking the Reagan playbook, right, of the American conservatives. I mean, aside from the Trump comparisons, I think we can trace back this to some early ambitions from the 80s, right? I mean, the trickle down economics, the Brahmins will get so rich, the top cream of the Brahmins will get so rich, and then whatever else. And it's more or less the same thing. I mean, we see that socioeconomic discrepancies exist in the United States. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if next to the Gita and whatever else Modi ji has on his altar, there's like a Reaganomics kind of textbook also, and a Keynes economics textbook right next to them, and he's just contemplating the whatever else. But I mean, look, there was this. I'm not sure if you read about this. It was a few months back. There was this bridge that collapsed in Gujarat also, and I mean, aside from the infrastructure problems that we can, talk about until we can both retire safely, right? I mean, there's also the notion of Modi didn't really do much about it, right? I mean, this kind of shows the spectacle aspect of the BJP, right? The reputation over the actual plans, right? I mean, what did Modi ji do? Especially in it's in home state also, right? That he goes to Gujarat, he's like, okay, koi baat nahi, we'll fix this also somehow, and then that's it, right? I mean, he was just trying to preserve his reputation. He didn't do much for the well-being of the Gujaratis or Indian infrastructure or anything, right? So this kind of shows that, the Reagan Trump kind of thing. It's like playing by the image, not so much caring to invest in the infrastructure that you're promising. So I'm kind of wary of how far India can go as long as the Modi regime is still in power. So we'll see. Bridges. Go ahead.
Yeah, Gujarati Bridge. So that bridge which collapsed, uh, actually that collapse happened only a few days before there was state elections in Gujarat.
Yeah.
So that's the ironic thing. And there was a sort of a clean sweep that the BJP did in that very election, and there was huge support which Modi still got in that election. So that's one aspect of it, of the thing that we are talking about. And but on the other hand, in fact, being that there are other realities of, I think, this country which you and I we have all come across, and I don't think they're very easy to change. Doesn't matter who runs the country, who's leading the country, but I think there are some realities which are very difficult to change. And the collapse of the bridge, if you ask me, is basically a problem of corruption, where there is low quality material being used for constructing the bridges and improper construction, which led to this sort of accident. And the the truth actually is also that the government of India in the last few years has always tried to put in a lot of money into the infrastructure, especially. So that's the thing. Like there is this union budget which has come very recently in India, and if you look at it, there has been minimal amount of support to things like public health and public education, but there has been an increased focus on capex or capital expenditure, which especially involves the spendings on infrastructure. So I think that's again it's all about the approach. So coming back to the question which we where we started all that, where do we look at things? How do we look at where things are going and where they could be in the next 25 years or so? I think it's very difficult to say because uh, there are the challenges are huge actually, because on the one hand you easily recognize that what's happening is not really fair. It's just leaving out a lot of people. But another aspect of the same thing is that India does not anyway have many options. So India cannot call itself a rich country. India cannot, you know, does not have many choices actually here. So very limited. number of choices, and therefore, if you actually look at the budget which came out recently, only a small section of the people could actually criticize it. All of those who realize and recognize the challenges that are there in front of the country right now, and those who understand and appreciate the thing, so they are just like, all right, this is what the approach is. So going by the approach of the present government, it looks like fine, they've done a fine job. But all in all, the given the challenges, it's not really, I don't think it's very easy to uh just you know it's just that somebody or the other gets left out all the time. That's the reality, I think. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, makes sense. I mean, uh, India has smart engineers. We saw with the Patel statue, we saw with the Ram statue. India knows how to build things. I don't think it's the problem of low quality material. I think it's about commitment, right? I mean,
Mm,
when it's about some big figure, right, in the Indian history, people will invest more than only the money. There's other kind of, emotional resources or cognitive
yeah,
resources or, soft power kind of things that people want this to withstand. If we would treat the roads and the bridges the same with the same quality
yeah.
commitment that we treat the Ram and the Patel statues, maybe there's gonna be that thing that you're talking about also.
Yeah,
But yeah, I mean, with the new budget, I mean, look, demonetization already screwed over India more than everybody thought. I think the only good thing that came out of it was the Paytm and the very advanced way of electronic transactions. It's honestly even more ahead than in the United States. You can do more things with Paytm in India than you can do with Apple Pay, more or less in most places in the United States. So it's definitely had some advantages. But there's other kind of growing pressing problems besides the infrastructure, right? If you look at what the liberal Indians are saying, right? They're saying, oh, caste inequality, gender inequality. Everybody picks their favorite poison and says that it's the most dangerous out of all of them, right? And
yeah,
you talk to somebody concerned about socioeconomic inequalities, they'll tell you that the caste system is really the root of the tree, and the infrastructure, you're kind of chopping a branch off the problem, but it doesn't address the fundamental problems that
yep,
the system has, right? And the
yeah,
same goes for like the gender inequalities or religious inclusivity, right, with the reservations and then whatever else.
yep.
So people kind of try to go in different ways. What do you think India needs more of? These types of humanities, soft types of equity claims, or do you think that more effort should be just channeled into building up that country somehow with money, or how do you weigh these problems?
So, I mean, to me, I think you just cannot not do the second thing that you mentioned, the latter one. You just can't not don't do. Like if you look at things only looking at India as if it were an isolated place on the map, then of course you can and you would want to focus on the first aspect of creating equity, of creating equality, of redistributing resources. At the same time, though, the truth is that India is not an isolated place on the planet, and the geopolitical realities of India currently are such that you just cannot not be in a position to be able to defend yourself in the first place. So if you can't defend yourself in terms of securing your borders, I think everything else will, uh, I think, shatter down all of it. So, for instance, currently we always had a problem on the left-hand border of ours with Pakistan, but currently we are having a huge trouble with China trying to create border villages across eastern India, and it has been a long pending issue now. It has been around 3 years now since there has been a very active presence of the Chinese military on the eastern flank, northeastern flank of India. So these are sort of realities which you cannot turn your face away from. So you need money for that. You need money to send your soldiers to these places. You need money to secure your borders. So this is something which is inevitable. That's the one thing. And in terms of uh, balancing the the different uh, possibilities or options, I think in some ways it could be said that the United Progressive Alliance, that is the Congress-led government between 2004 and 2014, it actually did a considerably good work in that regard because they brought out some programs which fundamentally change the way development is imagined or should be imagined, especially in terms of India. One, if you have heard of a program called NREGA, Narega. So this is a rural job guarantee program, and it says that if you are living in a rural area, the government guarantees that you will have a minimum of 100 days of employment every year of manual labor. So this is a minimum. 100 days you will have it if you are living in a rural area. So this was a different angle of redistributing wealth. So that's something which something like Modi government does not really. That's not how Modi government approaches the whole idea of development. It's very top down. So it would argue that, if the rural economy has to grow, it will grow because the money will trickle down. So that's how they would imagine it, that, you just create things at the top, it will trickle down, and that's how it will go, rather than thinking about direct action or direct intervention into the rural spaces. I mean, there are things which are being done. There is a new program in the current budget which is about rural housing, and a good amount of money has been allocated in the present budget on the aspect of rural housing. So it's actually uh, a lot of it is a matter of approach more than anything. But I think the 2004 to 2014 UPA government actually did really well in striking a balance between growth and redistribution. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there were skirmishes on the Chinese border, but every couple of years there's some casualties or something that happens. Yeah, security first is an obvious problem, but I think the nitpicky Indian political scientist, maybe not so much kind of like the outside mainstream perception, but if you talk to somebody that maybe works in the field, they can maybe say national business is Modi ji's business. Foreign business is Jai Shankarji's business.
Mm,
They should have separate budgets with different kind of reallocations, and it's up between each other. And if you see,
mm,
some ambitious Indian nationalists can say, "Hey, Jai Shankar is realigning with Russia. He's bringing back the Nehru blueprints of the '60s, right? He wants to reestablish some sort of energy trades and." Um, stand up to a Anglo world order kind of thing, even at the cost of maybe losing credibility in the West with the English speaking world. And he's very outspoken about this. I'm not making this up, right? Almost every time
yeah.
when the Western press is, or when Jai Shankarji goes to the West, they're like, well, sir, what are you doing with all these petrols and whatever else? And he's like, hey, this is a realist world. There's no specific rules. Look at what you guys have done for centuries. Are you guys really gonna pin India for trying to secure some energy for a developing country? I thought you guys like developing countries. I thought you guys like the growing democracies. What happened to that, right? So he's very strongly defending that this is not a contradiction for India, right? To get the resources, you need to grow. It's not India's fault that the
Yeah.
petrol is with the Russians and the Saudis and whatever else, right? So whatever else. What's your take on that? Do you think it's a good foreign policy strategy to secure as much as you can? Because then there's still the worry of how is this going to affect the price of eggs at home? So what if there's more petrol? I mean, people use the same infrastructure. It's not like there's many new cars, right? All the Tata trucks that are older than both of us put together and whatever else. So, an Indian pessimist can say, well, this is not actually benefiting the country, right? I mean, what the amount of petrol you use to run 20 kilometers in India, you can use for 100 almost anywhere else in the developed world. It's not only about getting resources, but of using them correctly, right? So
Yeah.
where do you think the discrepancies are in that sense?
So that's very true, actually, what you mentioned. And from how what I understand of India's foreign policy is that India's foreign policy is strongly it strongly adheres to the middle path. So it makes alliances with people, but it is clear that it does not want to side with any of the major powers. So right now, for instance, we are looking at a world which is increasingly moving towards something like what we saw in the Cold War, where you have two blocks and you have countries supporting one bloc or another. So I think India's policy is very clear that we are going to have a good relation with both the blocks, and we will not be siding with one of the blocks. So for this particular development, for instance, just look at it. China has been such a trouble for India for such a long time now, 3 years especially has been. But in this coming year, we are going to host the Chinese president not once but twice, and he is going to take part in the regional, or not really regional. It's an international organization now. It's called the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So this is a group of people who are like-minded and who do not, who believe that the Western hegemony has to be fought against. And so this is led by China, and it includes a lot of countries which the West won't particularly admire. But and India is a part of SCO. India is soon going to take up the presidentship of SCO, and at the same time, India has struck a good number of alliances with many of the Western nations as well. You have something called uh, the Quad, where you have the US and UK and India, Australia. So these four countries, you have a regional sort of cooperation group, security cooperation, non-hostile sort of. That's how it has been imagined, and other sort of one-to-one relationships, for instance, with the UK. And so India has, and then a lot many with individual Middle Eastern countries. So India is very clear that the best way for India to go forward is to not allow any channels to be closed. So India is very, so that no, that's what the truth for India is. India can hate China, but India cannot stop Chinese import, man. India will not be able to survive without Chinese import. India will not be able to survive without Russian guns and Russian weaponry. And definitely, India will never be able to survive without Western financial institutions or Western uh, geopolitical realities. Uh, so, in that sense, India is trying to, for a very long time, trying to create a balancing act, trying to contribute in a positive manner, so if I can say, in some of the smaller countries, for instance, Sri Lanka or even in Afghanistan, India is trying to have that sort of a positive, uh, relationship with these countries, whatever the realities of their own these own countries might be. But I think more than anything, India is India is clear that India will not feel safe if it chooses one block over the other. And at the same time, Andre, the the these blocks wants India to choose somebody. That's another aspect of it. We had the German defense minister coming over to India some time back. We had the secretaries from United States coming, and and if you look at their statements, they consistently said that what China has been doing to India is really uh, bad and it's hostile, and India should retaliate or India should answer it properly. So this is the sort of I think situation for India's foreign policy. That's how I look at it.
Good. There's a lot to extrapolate there. I mean, I think you clearly outlined the strategy. India wants to be friends with everybody without making any enemies, which is a
Yeah,
very ambitious but not realistic outcome, right? I think that's right on, right? I mean, especially with the growing um, RSS Vedantist kind of Ayurveda for everybody and Namastes and yogas for everybody and whatever else, right? So that that publicity that India is trying to capitalize. India is the mother of the world. We gave so much to the world, and the number zero, and whatever, right? So that ball kind of rolls, right? It gets a couple of Westerners maybe curious about what India really is about until they get more experience. Then we wait and see, Hannah.
yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, I mean, I think you also correctly outlined, right? The Russian resources, the Chinese resources. I mean, Joseph Nye calls this the international competition cooperation paradox, right? Because it's like even the United States and China trade with each other. Not even U.S. manufacturing industry can survive without Chinese supply chains and whatever else. So in that
right.
sense, I mean, it's a very neaty great game because you can't. It's not going to be isolated in the way that the Cold War was isolated, right? The two totally autonomous spheres of influence, the growing internet and technology and interdependence of the markets show that this is a different type of challenge, right? It's not
Yeah,
so distinctly like are you with us or not kind of mentality because
yep,
everybody depends on everybody else, and it's a very sophisticated four-dimensional chess game if you want to call it that or something.
yep,
But yeah, we'll see. I mean, the BRICS are still there, right? I mean, there's still a lot of debates, especially now with the Ukrainian war. People are saying this is only gonna devalue the dollar. I mean, if you remember, it was maybe last year that the euro dropped to the dollar for the first time, 1-to-1 parity or something
yep,
like that. So people are saying that the era of the dollar is over. The reason why the dollar had power is because petrol money was dollar and in the dollar currency. But given that the petrol states are moving closer towards China, and then China is growing its soft power diplomacy, building infrastructure in developing world in the global
yep,
south, and the Pakistanis like the Chinese more than the Indians like the Chinese, right? So I mean, the China will always have that extra trump card when India tries to be too pushy, at least against Pakistan, because it's like the bigger brother that can settle the score later for them or something like that, and then if India doesn't play this out correctly, it will use the favoritism of the United States, right? The only reason why the Chinese dogs don't bark is because the American dogs bite also, right? Where the Chinese bark, the America can bite also, right? So that's the problem. That's
yeah,
the deterrence aspect of the hegemonic games, right? But who knows for how long that's going to last? Because
yep,
as you said, the Chinese leadership is coming to India. I mean, remember how aggressive Indian domestic politics were against the Chinese when COVID started. Oh, that China is
yep,
bringing the Kali Yuga, they're bringing the apocalypse, they're going to screw us all, whatever else. And the rhetoric was pretty legitimate, right? I mean,
yeah,
maybe 10 million people died or something like that because of COVID. And in India was chaos, right? People were selling oxygen tanks on the black market and whatever else. It was a very difficult kind of constraint that, in India being so close to China, it had
yep,
such a consequential kind of impact there, right? So Modi ji was banning all the TikToks and all the Chinese software and whatever else. I mean, he was even banning Indian people from using WhatsApp groups that would complain about COVID or the Modi regime or whatever else, right? So, uh, yeah, it's very hard to see like how democratic India is. I personally at least don't buy into the story that oh India is the greatest democracy of Asia. It has the greatest voters in Asia. I'm pretty sure in elections Indian voter turnout is even greater than American voter turnout or something. I mean, sure, as far as raw numbers, India votes, but matlab, the way that the system is structured, it's still very illiberal in nature, right? It still mimics a lot of the authoritarian policies. I mean, Modi is democratically elected, but he doesn't act like a democratic leader as such, right? I mean, he's more or less like Indira. He's less like Nehru, and he's more like Indira. It's like my way or the highway, and there's no basically middle ground. You can't. I mean, he likes to project this notion that he's negotiable, right? They can negotiate with him, that he's approachable with the uncle vests and whatever else. But it's not really the case, right? I mean, he's really trying to take the best out of every country and try to build India, but not in an efficient way because India has so much potential, right? And that's really what grieves me whenever I come to India. It's like there's so many people, so many kind-hearted people with ambition for themselves, for their families, for what that country should be like. And I think that vision is genuine. I really think that uh,
Yeah.
the forward-looking promises are good, but with these kinds of leaderships, I don't think that India can get that ball rolling for themselves, and that's really where my legitimate concern is, right? And there's always that wave of regardless of how much you try to contextualize something as a fiscal problem or a security problem or whatever else, there's always the liberal counterwave that says no, the root of the problem is actually something else, right? The root of the problem is in some sort of social, civic, whatever else, right? And those
Yeah.
voices are getting louder and louder, right, with the Supreme Court, the way it votes and whatever else. And yeah, and there is a growing private sector in India also, especially in North India. So we'll have to wait and see, but it's very hard to stay optimistic. That's all I'm trying to say. And I'm not trying to say this for intentional detriment to India. I'm trying to say this
Yeah.
for the realistic on the ground kind of problems that I'm not entirely sure what could India use the most to move the fastest in the direction in which it wants to. So, yeah.
I would agree. In fact, I don't know if you came across a prominent sort of news which is flowing across in the context of India, especially, is one of the, in fact, the biggest businessman of India. His name is Gautam Adani, and how his shares have tumbled like crazy in the last just 7 days, 8 days now, and his personal wealth has decreased by $100 billion in just last 8 days,
Mm.
and he is shifted from being number three in the Forbes richest people in the world to now he's at number 16th. And all of this uh, followed not a huge, pomp and show. It was just one report that was published by Hindenburg Group from the United States, and which, uh, you know, changed everything for him, for his business, and for even India, you could say to a certain extent. So, I mean, we can just leave out that portion for now as to whether the report was genuine and to what degree and what were the facts from both sides. But just you could just look at this fact that a single report, if it can dislodge you in a manner of that sort, it in some ways is an indicator that India has not reached a stage where the confidence, or what looks like confidence right now, can be taken as a short thing. It just doesn't look so dependable right now. If a report can change so much for you, and what does it mean to the whole, credibility of how you got up, how you got to that position, how then all of the things about India come into question, right? How do systems work here? Is it true that India is growing in a real sense? Because if things can change like that, what is the reality? So those questions do come up, I think.
Yeah. But I mean, everybody loses money. Even Elon Musk lost like $200 billion or something. I think he broke the record for the richest man on earth and the highest financial loss in one fiscal year or something along those lines. So I
Yeah.
mean, it really depends. But uh, it's actually easy to be defensible, if I may, in this context about the fiscal credibility of India or whatever else. Because if you look at the industries that won and lost or were on the same kind of equilibrium during COVID, obviously Petrol won and Zoom won and then the telecom softwares and whatever else. Elon Musk made more money through Amazon. Sorry, Bezos made more money through Amazon during COVID because people couldn't go out shopping and they were deferring
Right.
to the shipping services and whatever else. So I mean, I think it's very easy to kind of generalize that discussion a little, right? And say, look,
Yeah.
this is not about some sort of Indian financial corruption as much as it is people that have an extraordinarily stable and reputable set of financial resources are now going to lose. Or in Ukraine, it doesn't matter. The oligarchs actually in Russia didn't lose as much as the media is saying that they're going to lose and whatever else. And you know,
Mm.
and whatever else. So it's just a question of who gets protected for what reason and what's their safety net. I think that's where the more pressing discussion is at. I mean, same can go for China, right? I mean, I don't know the exact number, but Shanghai has one of the largest numbers of millionaires and billionaires in the world or whatever
Yeah.
else. So many Chinese or states and cities and whatever else are still developing, right? I mean, a lot of things that can be said about India in that sense can also be said about China, right? These two giants of Asia are not like the Germans or the French with long history of prosperity and good fiscal policies. These are both countries with a long history of rural development and civil problems, and the West coming over and trying to do something weird with them, right? So it's not um, as if this is an exclusively Indian issue. I think this kind of points to the bigger question of uh,
Mm.
why are these people so well protected to the extent to which the trickle down story doesn't really happen, right? I mean, think about Gautamji a year ago, right? If trickle down economics was so wonderful, then why didn't he invest in rural India and facilitate further these kinds of agricultural problems you were talking about? I mean, so I think this is a bigger question than India only. Yeah.
Yep. Just got me thinking a little bit about uh, Ukraine war and the impact that it had or is having on India. So yeah.
I actually think it's riskier. I actually think it's a lot
Mm.
riskier than a lot of people highlight. Um, And I'm not just saying this as an Eastern European, right? I'm saying this because I read this stuff every day, and you see, things are getting taken out of context very easily. For example, there is this passage that was quoted in India Times and in a bunch of other Western news outlets that was saying, Modi ji, clear perspective, the war is not good, right? And then they just took this one line only, this one sentence, and praised Modi for the human rights hero of developing
Mm.
states and he's there for the Ukrainians and blah blah blah. Not really, because if you actually read the whole speech and the whole conversation, right after he
Mm.
says war is not the answer, but Russia, we like you, we need your oil, we need your gas, we need your whatever else, right? So I mean, this is kind of the problem that I'm seeing here, right? It's like
Yeah.
the stance on India is extraordinarily clear. I mean, Jai Shankar is clear. He's like, they don't care. When brown people were dying in World War II, when Churchill was starving Bengalis, the West didn't care. So why should we care now? I mean, I'm pretty sure that's the what most people would say. I mean, I don't know what it's like in India now. Here in the United States, everybody has Ukraine flags now and whatever else. But if you were to ask 2 years ago Americans where's Ukraine on the map, they wouldn't even know. Maybe they'd say somewhere in Latin America or in Africa or something, right? So this is really the problem, right? The next trend that grasps the attention. We're always living in historical times. We had the COVID pandemic, and then we have the war in Ukraine. It's just one global catastrophe after the other one. It's yeah. But as far as India is concerned, I mean, here's the thing: like Ukraine cannot expect anything out of India, right? There's no
Yeah.
very long historical track record of Indo-Ukrainian foreign policy or whatever else. At least I don't think that there's many, very clear examples of one country helping out the other one. I mean, there's broadly speaking Soviet-Indian relations in the 20th century, but not many of them were going through the Kiev channel. Most of them were going up to Moscow only directly. So
Yeah.
but in that sense, it's just very strange how not even the United States can call out the Indians on this, right? They can't say that, oh, Modi ji is supporting the war or whatever else, right? So I think India gets a free pass here, right? Because it's not a European state. If India was a European state, it would have been a different discussion. But it's kind of interesting how, uh, where it's like Kanye. Kanye can say whatever he wants, right? And there's not that many repercussions because there's a distance from the usual type of people that make those kinds of things. And yeah.
No, I think you're right. I think absolutely spot on, because if you actually look at when the first wave of sanctions were put
Hmm.
across from the West against Russia, and when the Indians first started to buy oil at that point of time, there was a clear anguish which the Western nations displayed against India. I was clear in saying that, there's something wrong here. Do you realize that you're not doing the right thing? And over the period of time, the statements changed, and the US clearly pointed out that, there is no problem in India buying oil from Russia. Why would we have a problem with that? So I think it's spot on what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, well, it's not their war, it's not their problem. India's still a democracy, right? I mean, they're just trying to kind of roll the ball on that uh, let's democratize countries kind of, that archaic mindset from 2 generations ago. It's like, oh, it's okay, they're a democracy, they're our friends, they can do whatever they want. It's not a problem, right? So because I mean, think about it. That's more or less the leadership that's still in power, maybe one generation aside, but the ones that are right, the generation of the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, they're the one with authoritative domestic and foreign policy capacity now, right? So they're kind of, recalling, oh, a few decades ago when they were our age, things were different. So we're just going to let it slide for the greater benefit or something along those lines, right? And yeah, that's what I'm saying. India can get a free pass here, but I think that there's always the risk of like, well, what happens when the war is over, whenever that's gonna be. I think this is a Bangladesh situation, Bangladeshi independence situation, 71 to 73. That's how I read this war, at least personally. I think that this is kind of like how the Bangladeshis wanted to be independent from Pakistan, so the Ukrainians are gonna try to be independent from Russia. So, yeah, I would say maybe at least another year until the problems are out of the way. But yeah. Go ahead.
No, and just that, I don't know why, but again, talking to you about India and how we uh, imagine India 20, 30 years from
Mhm.
now. So I think one of the very important factors which has to be discussed when you talk about the immediate future of India is the demographics of India. And currently, India is the youngest country in the world in terms of the average age of the citizen. So the average age here is close to 27, and it's very different from many countries. I think if you look at some of the European countries, we have the average age at 39 or 35 and so forth. So India is young and still getting young for the time being, and the projection is that it will be around the year 2040, around that time, that India will pass through this youth sort of phase, and then the population will start to age, and which is going to be a huge challenge. So, right now we are talking about what is technically called the demographic dividend, the demographic benefit that India is getting currently because of it being a young country. And so, young country, the two advantages being, the labor is available and the consumption is relatively more. So both of these things benefit India right now, but it is a matter of years, because this cycle, of course, goes on for every country. Every country becomes young and old. So India has this. So this, I think, as we're talking about it, it's a very, very critical uh 15, 20 years, I think, right now for India, because it is sort of the make or break sort of a situation, and it will really define uh, what India will be, and even what South Asia, I think, will be. Because just look at Sri Lanka, which recently got into a huge problem, which is they're just not come out of it right now. It's trying to creep up, trying to come up again, and get into a position to uh, be some economically stable. But on the left hand side of India, we have Pakistan, which is very uh, quickly getting into a whirlpool of its own. It is in a deep, deep economic trouble, um and it has been so for a long time now, and it is, moving towards something like a Sri Lanka situation. That's how I look at it. It's in deep economic distress, Pakistan right now. So I think with these kind of examples in front of you, it really depends on how India takes itself forward in the next 15, 20 years. Um, and that's going to be, I think, very crucial 15, 20 years ahead. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Maybe to add more detail to the conversation, India has the opposite problem that the Japanese and the Koreans have, right? They're
Correct.
having the most of their working capacity being over 60, so that kind of completely slows down the economy, right? We can see the opposite effects in the opposite circumstance, right? So given the demographics problems of the Koreans and the Japanese, we see how it slows down all possible economic
Yeah.
progress to a measurable extent, right? I mean, is the Japanese economy still growing? Yes. Is it going to grow the way it grew in the early 2000s? Most likely not, right? Even with American protection and Taiwan right next to them and whatever else, right? So that means that now it's India's turn to have the good problem of having a very, very young, wide demographic. But India is
Correct.
also, a huge cause of brain drain, right? A lot of smart Indians go west, everywhere in the West. I mean, you'd be surprised, but at my hometown in Romania, the greatest demographic for a medical school is actually Desi. It's like Indians and Punjabis and whatever else. Seriously, because the medical school is like well reputable, and it's
Yeah.
an easy degree, and then they can come back to India and practice in India also or whatever else. And so
Yeah.
it's for like the IT sector, obviously, and whatever else. And this is just to name a few. Who knows what other people with different ambitions and whatever else. So with that,
Yeah.
with this much mobility, right? Then you have the youth and the energy and the desire to migrate and whatever else. Let's not pretend that everybody our age is in love with their countries, right? I don't have a specific kind of love for Romania myself either, right? So I can empathize with any Indian that it's like, okay, whatever, I can just leave and then do something else myself, right? So in that sense, the, especially now with the new English leadership also being busy, right? There's going to be more open doors for the Indian community to also go to the UK and whatever else. So yeah, it is going to be paramount, but it's also about how you stabilize the output, right? Because it's not like a lot of people are going to come to India to work to the same degree that people have been going outside, right? I mean, and these problems aren't new to India. The generation of our parents, they would go a lot to UAE and nearby states to work in
Yeah.
construction or in petrol or whatever. Also,
Yep.
this is our generation, but doing the same thing with the ITs and whatever else. So
Yeah.
it really is a question of well who's gonna stay and actually do the hard work for India, not just who's our age and ambitious, right? Because that doesn't say much. It also says more about
Yeah.
yeah who's gonna look at India in the long term. And about Pakistan,
Yeah.
there was an earthquake. Musharraf died yesterday or 2 days ago or
Yep.
something. So Imran Khan got shot in the foot. There
Yeah.
was a flood. I don't know, a few months back or a
Yeah.
year back or something. So if they want to undo the Partition Act and they just want to get re-annexated back to India or something like that, I think the Pakistanis are too proud and they want to have their own country and their
Yeah.
self-determination and their caliphates and whatever else. But yeah, Yeah, I think you're right, and I don't think China's gonna jump into the fire for the Pakistanis on that one. I think they're on their own. We don't see the Chinese doing much for Afghanistan after the United States left, right? So they're kind of, taking the spectator seat, watching everything unfold. They're looking at what's happening in Ukraine, maybe the United States, obviously, but yeah, as far as India, but somebody else's problem is somebody else's opportunity to grow and to succeed, right? So. Um,
That's right.
if India is so keen on complaining about the problems with the Pakistan, well, Pakistan is not in a good position right now in any conceivable sense, right? So India can't really just say, oh well, we have the Pakistani borders and blah, blah. Not really. It's an opportunity for the Indian demographics to actually do something professionally meaningful. The question is, what is there to
Yeah,
learn, right? Hmm.
it's a big question, and I think you're so right because you just can't equate a young demographic to a productive demographic by itself. Because the real problem, again, if you look at India and India since independence or in the last 150 years, the one of the most important problems of India is that India does not ever did not ever develop a manufacturing sector. So what we had was we always worked in the fields. We did agriculture, and all of us did agriculture, and then we shifted to services. If you want to go to any sort of services today, you will have Indians everywhere all the time. And but if you look at any other country which is grown and which is come to a position where it is right now, all of those countries have built themselves on manufacturing. So if you look at the United States, the late 19th century, early 20th century, you look at the Industrial Revolution in England, you look at China in the last, since Mao, let's say 1970 onwards, and all of the countries who have grown on the back of manufacturing. And this is one reality which is really, really hard to digest. If you really want to grow, you need to have a manufacturing sector, which we don't have for I don't know what reason.
Yeah. And then we can go full circle to the 1991 problems of do they
Yep.
actually invest in the agriculture and the manufacturing or not? And
Yeah,
yeah, I
that's
mean,
the thing.
it's, well, say,
No, so for instance, even after independence, even after 1947, there have been efforts to have state-run industries. There have been effort to create industries, but I cannot pinpoint the reasons why India never took off as an industrial nation. It never did, and it does not now. Again, it has just shifted. If you look at the 1990s, what is the most important reason which got the economy lifted into 1990s? One of the most important, at least, is the foreign investment. That's what has changed. We had a huge amount of foreign investment in especially the IT sector. So that's what American companies
yeah,
especially did is that come here, create a BPO, the outsource the you know manpower in this particular sector because you have Indians who can work in the BPO, and and this was our shift from agriculture to IT and to services. But what about manufacturing? We never had that. So I think that's a huge challenge, and because also one important thing being manufacturing is what absorbs the most youthful populations in all of these countries that we talked about. That's where all the youth basically go from villages. That's how villages turn to urban centers in the first place, because people from the rural areas they go and they work in industries in the urban setups. So that hasn't happened in India, and that's why we must appreciate and acknowledge the fact that unemployment is a huge problem in India even now. It hasn't changed actually. Yeah.
I can actually tell you why India didn't wake up on time with the manufacturing sector. People didn't
Hmm.
like Nehru. They
Hmm.
didn't. I'm a huge Nehru apologetic in 20th century Indian history. I think he's the only one that actually had his head in the game. But put it this way. Think about like the Indian minds of the grandparents' generation and the grand-grandparents' generation, right? The Britishers are gone. World War II is over. This is before we saw the growth of the Cold War in the 50s and whatever, the late 50s, right? So that pivot era of like 1945, 47 to about 50, 51-ish, right? Before we actually saw the Soviet Union actually growing and whatever else. Yeah. So there was a tremendously important civil rights transformation in India, right? There's the Ambedkar also, and the constitutional reforms as well. So a lot of public discourse and a lot of the attention of the 40s and the 50s in India was focused on that stabilization of the states' right of self-determination, the states' right to blah blah whatever else, right? So much effort and political capital. I'm not saying wasted. Obviously, India is an independent state. There have been some constitutional reforms, not fully followed. Maybe that's a discussion for later. But there was the attempt, right? There's the ambition. There was the
Yeah.
attempt at those kind of constitutional reforms, and then the worry becomes a lot of people invest a lot of hopes and dreams in that, right? To see for the first time in centuries a free India and independent India. That took a lot of kind of emotional power. That took a lot of effort from, and it was
Yep.
collective, right? It wasn't Gandhiji by himself that waved at the
Yep.
Britishers, and then Churchill's like, okay, okay, fine, 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 you guys can go, right? It wasn't so one-dimensional. It was a lot of Indian manpower behind that movement, right? So I think so much of of that mentality, that collective mentality, got invested into a self-determinant India, that they didn't have the capital left and the attention and the research, right, to kind of go into it. Because think about it, there's one thing to say this is the desirable effect of a particular policy, right? It's easy for us to talk with whatever hindsight or even in the status quo we want,
Yeah.
for everybody to have agricultural access, and we don't want for people to starve in India or whatever else. Sure, fine, take it. But how do we get there, right? Like, where's the money coming from? Where's the research coming necessary? Especially in the 20th century, actually, the reason why the United States really bloomed in the 60s is because the agricultural sector was brilliant. It had very, very, very good engineers in the agricultural sector. I mean, there's all these stories of like Soviet spies from the Soviet satellites from all the countries, not just Russian, Romanians also. There's all these stories of Soviet spies going as diplomats into the USA to try to steal. They didn't try to steal the intelligence, right? They weren't even concerned about, this is before the Bay of Pigs, right? So there wasn't so much noise about nuclear secrets or whatever else. What they wanted was the intelligence of how to make good agriculture, right? That was actually the priority also. So not even in a, right, because if you take first world, second world, and the third world, right, we abandoned the language of the second world, right? But what was the second world? The second world was the Soviet bloc itself, right?
Right.
So these second world states, their ambition wasn't to weaponize or whatever else, right? South Africa gave away their nukes, and the Ukrainians gave away their nukes. I mean, the Indians and the Pakistanis were smarter in that sense, but that's a different conversation, right? If Ukraine didn't give up their nukes, they wouldn't have the war today. But anyhow, point being is, when those like counterintelligence missions were happening to go to America, they didn't care to learn about how to spy on other countries or how to build bombs or whatever else. They cared about what are the good chemicals to put in the soil and the fertilizers to ensure that people won't starve, right? You can see every textbook of Soviet history that says developmental issues, starvation problems, malnutrition problems, or whatever else. Sure, but eventually the textbooks don't tell you much about how they actually transitioned out of that starvation problem, right?
Right.
Most of it was actually thanks to American intelligence that was taken on visits, right? It's like, think about it. Most people say, oh, the diplomats want to go to Washington. They want to see the great political legacy of the winners of World War II. No, they wanted to go to the rural areas, man. They're like, send me to Iowa, send me to the Midwest, send me to wherever else. Let's see the crops. Let's see the potatoes. Let's see the corn. Let's see. No, really, though. That's how they got with it,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, but that's the thing. It's like the Soviet countries weren't concerned about self-determination. They were in the right kind of mental space to create different types of priority for their countries, right? I'm pretty sure if the former Soviet states had to fight for independence from a colony the way that the Indians did, it would have been a little harder to sort of generate that kind of political momentum, right? So
Mhm.
I don't think it's as easy as saying different countries, different priorities, or one's more myopic than the other. One's just in a different kind of geopolitical circumstance than the other, and that affects a lot of the material decision-making capacities also, right? Um, that's really where I see with it. If India had like a longer history of independence, right? Like if the Britishers would have left at the beginning of World War One or something, that would have given the Indian space another 3-4 decades to formulate what would good infrastructure look like. So I think at the time they couldn't have done anything better because there was again so much effort invested into seeing a free India and a constitutional, like an
Yeah.
autonomous constitutional India and whatever else. And right? I mean, look at how powerful the courts are today. There was so much transformation about what the authority of Indian institutions should be, right? And a lot of it was exclusionary elimination, right? Not English this, not English that. I mean, sure, there's some Commonwealth residual parts in the politics or whatever else, right? But the collective intention was we don't want like English stuff, right? That was the mentality at the time. Something for Indians, made by Indians, made in India, blah blah,
Mhm.
Hind or whatever, right? So that was the mentality at the time, and if everybody wants to know how the institutions work, you're not going to have the personnel to do the research on the agriculture and whatever else. That's why the debates resurfaced back in 91. And even in 91, when the opportunity came, and it was like, no, the technology, the internet, IBM, hooray, hooray, right? So,
Mhm.
so I think 91 is the bigger missed opportunity. I wouldn't pin it so much on the 40s or the 50s.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, but that certainly is a question, right? I mean, what you just mentioned that uh the 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 time needed to get into a position to become more self-reliant on in terms of your manufacturing power. Of course, even if one accepts the uh, the argument that the 1940s and 50s was a time when we were not ready, Indians were not ready. So, of course, the question would be asked, why not in the 1990s then, right? So, yeah, definitely it's a missed opportunity. So, but I think in whatever the thing may be, there needs to be some sort of a manufacturing in order to absorb this population because Andre, the the realities are really grim if you look at in terms of the kind of population that India has. We just crossed China recently, so we are number one now in terms of population, and it's a huge sort of crisis. You have actually, I'm sure, already witnessed what happens when there is some sort of a public examination in India. How many people approach and how many people apply for such an examination. So those are really difficult questions, and those realities is not addressed. They, I think, only work to keep increasing the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Sure. And again, the JRF type examinations and the foreign service types of things. I mean, everybody wants the same thing, but in India there's more people, so there's obviously lesser chances of having the same thing. Um,
Yeah.
I'm not really sure how India can solve that because it's not as if the Indian government seems very keen on creating more jobs in that sector either, right? So it seems that there's a growing demand
Yeah.
to work in that place, but they're not going to fit in everybody. I mean, same goes for everywhere, right? Not everybody with a political science or an international degrees in Germany or the United States is actually going to end up working for the government or something along those lines. And then there's all these filters and biases about corruption and nepotism and who you know who or whatever else. And so it's more or less the same. But here's where I really think, here's what perplexes me about India, at least, that is very kind of historically unusual, if I can call it that, right?
Mm.
Europeans are very loud when they're hungry. That's how we got the French Revolution. That's how we got 1848 stuff and whatever else. When Europeans are hungry, they rebel, right? They make a lot of noise. A monarchy usually collapses. Something happens in that national regime, right? There's infrastructure being built, some sort of civic reform, whatever else. Indians are not loud when they're hungry. I think that's difficult. Indians are
Yeah.
very forbearant of of starvation, right?
Yeah.
Churchill starved the Bengalis. There was no noise by the Indians, right? The Britishers came, the Mughals came. Even today, right? I mean, there's right. Let's look at UP, Bihar again, which are some of the least developed states, right? There's not much noise in UP or Bihar about malnutrition or starvation or development.
Yeah.
People just
Right.
accept, right? This is the way God intended it to be, or this is the whatever
Yeah.
else, right? I mean, the framework of the Varna system has
Yeah.
psychological effects also. They're like, oh, this is where I am. It's very fatalistic, unfortunately, right? It's like this is where things are. This is where I am. I can't change things. Blah blah blah. Then there's always that higher power and whatever else. So that's what
Yeah.
concerns me about India, right? What's the most recent protest? The RSS in South India, or something like that. If I remember correctly, it was like last week or something like that, right? So you see, people can protest about, um, I don't know, something that they care about, but for some reason, it's not about food. I mean, even during the plague of COVID or whatever else, the market was only open an hour a week on Monday only, right? And for so many people, I mean, again, I was in Haryana. I'm not sure how it was in Rajasthan or in the south or something, but in Haryana, the markets were open an hour a week on Monday only, 10 in the morning to 11 in the morning, and that's it. How are you going to sustain, so many people, right, with 1 hour of market only to get all the groceries and the whatever else? So that's really what I don't understand, right? It, the folks just accept the for some reason passively accept this kind of things, right? I mean, think about it. Most kids, when they're hungry, they will make a lot of noise until the parents feed them or something like that. But the Indians are just like, it's okay, whatever. I don't think they like consciously accept it either, right? But it's also like
Mm.
don't try to do anything about it, and it's very hard to always be, right, the outsider that whatever else, because then there's always the problems of like, oh, this is their problem, and there's always the outsider that tries to do something
Mm.
for a community or something like that. So the change has to be internal, right? It's not about
Yep.
gaining trust or whatever else, but if there people are just going to postpone something that is not being complained about, right? Take climate policy, for example. Since the era of scientists of the Carl Sagans in the early 70s, we knew that we're screwed, right? We knew about the dangers of the transformations in the natural space that will affect displaced community. That we knew that we're going to have increased natural disasters, right? With all the earthquakes in Nepal and Japan and the wildlife fires in Australia and California and whatever else. We knew this was going to happen, right? We knew that it was going to displace people, that it was going to families are going to be broken apart, people have to move and relocate, we knew infrastructure was going to be lost, but nobody cared, right? Nobody that actually had the power to change cared because nobody complained. Why should they listen to two or three really smart scientists that had data for 50 years in the future if the petrol companies, right, they're investing billions and billions of dollars today, right, for the cars to move
Yeah.
to be for and whatever else? It's like, why worry about the long-term losses if the
Yep.
short-term gains are so obviously good, right? So
Mm.
same I think is the problem here, right? It's like it's not like the Indian government doesn't care. I think they care to some extent, right? That's why they had the 2 kg rice policy a few years back also for all the
Right.
families, whatever it was, right? I
Mm.
don't think that the government doesn't care, but if you don't tell a government what to do, right, as a responsible citizen, then the
Yeah.
government is not going to put that on the priority list, right?
Yeah. 100%. I mean, 100%. The whole idea, I think, of democracy is closely related to uh, pressurizing the government. I mean, not for a better word. I mean, it's just that everybody have their own demands. Everybody wants some things or the others, but not everybody would be powerful enough to put it forward, or not powerful enough that their demands would automatically be there on the priority list, or else people will not be pressurizing the government enough so that the demands is on the priority list. So I think, if you ask me, it's not possible to satisfy everybody in a democracy. you will always leave out somebody or the other. So I think it some way or another, it is the responsibility of the groups themselves, of individuals themselves, that you raise your voice and you put forward as to what you think is the right thing to do, not just for yourself, not just for issues which affect yourself as an individual, but issues which you believe in. I think, as you said, there needs to be a voice. You need to raise it. So yeah, and maybe earlier, sooner rather than later. So yeah.
Yeah, but there's only two types of disagreements that get attention from the media. Or I'm sure there's more, but in Indian news outlets, there's only two of them, at least that I can tell you. Right? I mean, it's the Sikhs whenever they were protesting against Indira, or the Sikh protests from what 2020, 2021, right? And in the Punjab area about the agricultural problems and whatever else.
Right.
And we also see in the news the protests of the RSS, right? Whenever the Bengali migrants were coming to Assam and they didn't have Aadhaar cards or whatever else, that was some noise. Or now the RSS protests in South India. But I'm sure there's a lot of other people that complain about a lot of other things in India, right? The women's rights is huge, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of women that make a lot of noise about civic equity and whatever else. But
Yeah.
you don't see that much in the news, right? So
That's right.
who knows who else is kind of trying to
That's
start a momentum, and it ends up as echo chambers and NGOs or something like that, and it never gains traction. Um, yeah, it really is a question of, well, who does? I mean, the middle class per se of India never protested, right? And this is
yeah.
what I don't understand. It's like India is
Yeah.
over acceptant of these kinds of constraints, right? And at this point, it's like,
Correct.
as an independent state with a promising future, with a lot of youth, right? With bright, global 21st century mentalities, whatever that means, right? So in that sense, it's like, why not? Why be so backward looking? Why do you let the Uncle G and the Auntie G that
Right.
was friends with like the Uncle G and the Auntie G of the 70s, then they were running the show, and now they're running the show, and then their kids are going to run the show, and the circle goes on, right? And
That's right.
I think that's very detrimental, because if people don't know how to also internally protest, right? I mean, I'm not saying like Sri Lanka or or Burma or something along those lines, but partially successful protest, right? I mean, there's people that make noise in the West also, and sometimes it changes. I mean, now we just kind of went down the rabbit hole of cancel culture or whatever else, right? But
Mm.
prior to these kind of like superficial notions of what it means to normatively reform a place, right? I mean, there's not much that people cover in India about these sorts of
Right.
things also.
So for you, is it that the coverage is a bigger problem, or not protesting enough is a bigger problem?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean,
Mm.
there's actually someone, if I can just drop a random plug, actually there is an Indian scholar. He was somewhere with New York, NYU, Columbia. I don't know what he's doing these days. Dilip Gaonkar. So Dilip Gaonkar wrote about history of reforms and protests and whatever else, and he's also uh, um, looking at India, right, and what he's saying that India can do or should do. And even according to his estimations, he's saying, well, India never really internally reformed, right? The I mean, the construction of Indian politics, I mean, everybody likes to get away with saying that India has no national identity because it's so ethnically and culturally and religiously diverse, and you know the story, whatever. Anyway,
Yeah.
point is, like, when people try to do otherwise, right? When people actually unificatory, holistic, monolithic, what makes India kind of thing. Uh, the chances of a movement like that happening are very low, right? Because people always emphasize more disagreements than agreements, right? And I think that's the patriotic problem in India, right? Everybody likes to gather around the flag when it's about something Jai Hind, right? But the second the Jai
Mm.
Hind chanting utterance is done, everybody goes back to their state business, right?
Yeah.
Everybody goes back to their respective religious business, or everybody does whatever, right? So there's not much and that lack of cohesion means there's very little to agree upon. And that's what makes democracy is great, because you can disagree, but when you can disagree with so many things, that's kind of difficult, right?
Mm.
But yeah, I really don't think there's going to be a meaningful protest, right? The leftists and the rightists of India are never going to come to a consensus. But I think the difficulty is that there's too many variations of left and right in India, and the English bicameral system is not really doing justice to the Indian politics. It feels more like a parliament, right? If there's like a party of the Sikhs, or like a Islamic party, or like a Hindutva party, or whatever else, and everybody would get their say, and it would be a different type of show, right? But with only BJP and Congress as options, I think that also limits a lot of balancing policies and priorities and whatever. And that's obviously not going to change. India is always going to remain bicameral. We can't get overly ambitious with that. But yeah, even to this day, even Indian scholars that worked on protests, if you look at their literature, they're saying that, in India accepts too much of the way things are, and doesn't do much, even if it can think a lot about the way things should be. There's too much of a from talking to doing kind of gap, and the Indian civic space has never closed, at least for India, right? Not against some different external force or something, but from Indians, by Indians, blah blah. There was never a sufficiently strong collective to generate that kind of movement, and who knows what will come from, if it will come at all, right? It really depends on what you think. I mean, with coverage, look, I don't know how, because everybody is using more of the WhatsApp kind of things and the encryption kind of thing. I think our generation overall is not as influenced with the news as our parents' generation. We get more information. We have different outlets. We are more connected to even external sources that tell us about where we are or whatever else, right? I mean, good news outlets talk about, other countries also, right? If you don't care about India today, has to say you can read Washington Post, you can read New York Times to get something about India also, right? So in that sense, it's not necessarily about coverage. It's more about, well, are people actually going to care to change it, right? Because Modi does a lot of, again, authoritative things, if you want to call it that. The whole, blackmailing Zuckerberg that he's going to cancel WhatsApp and Facebook in India and whatever else. And he did say that, right? And then because the consumer base is so wide, and India is maybe the widest consumer base.
Yeah, it is.
Right. So, yeah, I'm not sure where the next big thing in India is going to come, but hopefully it's not another Patel statue. That I can tell you. Yeah.
Hoping the same, but I mean, these are difficult questions. I don't even know if we could have a pinpointed answers to these. These are very deep, I think, and difficult questions to answer, right? Like what you just mentioned. If you ask us why is it that the protest never happened? Why is it that the voices weren't raised enough number of times or with enough intensity, with enough number of people? I think at least that these are difficult questions to answer.
I don't think so. I think it's for the sheer reason that there's not enough agreement amongst these discrepancies. I can tell you why it's not happening. I can tell you why the disagreements are there. I can't tell you how to make them agree with each other, right? All the tensions with all the internally religious kind of things. I mean, India likes to a lot of people in India, not just the government. And I mean, I'm not sure how big of a problem this is, but right, being former students of religious studies and being diligent with our studies of religion. But put it this way, like, there's that very, very, um, for whatever reason, believable, persuasive narrative of secularism in India, right? But what's Indian secularism is not what Western secularism is. Western secularism is separation between church and state, right? The state should not have any influence from religion or religious imports, right? The Ten Commandments are not laws, for example, or something along those lines, right? But that's not what secularism means in India. What's secularism in India? We tolerate each other. We don't accept each other. We tolerate each other, right? If you talk to like a hardcore Hindu and a hardcore Muslim, they're not going to say we accept each other as brothers under the flag or something like that, right? They will say,
Right.
hey, he's over there, I'm over here, and that's it, right? And that's never going to stop, right? I mean, the Tibetan diaspora doesn't even have Aadhaars. They don't pay taxes, they can't vote, they don't have Indian passports, right? So anyway, but that's maybe for another time. And all these tensions, right? The Jains are super quiet and they never make any noise and they just eat their fruits and they don't touch potatoes and that's it, and whatever else, right? So, and then all the Muslims want halal food and they don't touch anything else and blah blah, right? So it's like everybody knows what they want, but it's very, how to say, in a very kind of different reality, as if they're not even in the same country kind of thing. And they're very proud about not talking to each other. I think that's where the really big problem is, right? I mean, the Southerners sometimes kind of gather together when North India is trying to be too Hinduification, like linguistically speaking, right? The Sanskritization, the Hinduification of the South. That's usually sometimes when the Southerners like put their differences aside and they say something to Delhi or something like that, right? But collectively speaking, there's just too. It's not that there's too many disagreements. There's just too many opinions to base those disagreements on, right? I mean, right, United States has its gender problem and its racial ethnic problems, sure, but there's not 20 different religions in the United States that all are indigenous to the United States or something like that, right? So I think that complicates things, and from the outside, and this is what I don't understand. Maybe you can explain me why. There's people our age that believe that, right? I've spoken to people our age that really believe that Indian secularism is working and it has no problems and it has no flaws and it's not about tolerating, but and then they pull the foreigner card. Oh, it's like all the Hindus like, no man, I have a Muslim friend, it's okay, and whatever else, right? So then it kind of goes nowhere from there. Maybe you can tell me why you think that this story kind of became so, I don't know, believable. Yeah.
I don't know. That's why I'm asking you. I don't know. These are difficult questions to answer, man, because I don't. I'll have. I think it's better to look at it from somebody else's eye. You sometimes understand better why you or your society is doing something which they're doing.
I mean, they have political ambitions, right? They like to delineate things because, okay, a lot of here's maybe like a discussion that is in political science that is not very popular, but I still think it's interesting, right? So a lot of people are saying, well, the future of like political agreements are, top down, that now we have the UN and the IMFs and the WTOs and all these big international institutions. So eventually, what's going to happen is that we're going to have even taller orders of like these kind of global political alliances type of stuff. And then it'll like trickle down the rules to, federal, state, whatever else, right? There's other people that say, no, it's that we have actually reached the limits, the pivots of what international institutions are, what they can be, what they can do. They can't do much, but whatever. But we have reached like, a collective global political limit of like what these institutions are. And actually the future of regimentation of policy is actually bottom up, right? The cities are going to become more powerful in that sense. It's going to be even less about the state and it's going to be more about the city, right? It's going to be less about Maharashtra. It's going to be more about Pune or something along those lines, right? It's going to be less about Karnataka and more about Bangalore or Bangalore, right? Or whatever else, right? So in that sense, that's really where some people are saying that eventually, um, because of these growing firms and, and how much power they have to invest in their particular state. I mean, look at California, right? There's California, but then there's the Bay Area also, right? Which is the San Francisco kind of area, right? And look at how developed and, the Bay Area has its own rules, more or less, than the rest of the state of California, than the rest of whatever else. So some people would say it's actually going to be a mobilization that way only, right? Like, if Hyderabad is going to be more and more Caliphate-esque, but it's going to be only Hyderabad itself, right? And whatever else.
Yeah.
And things can be that way only, right? So I think it's an interesting discussion because first of all, it's more realistic than thinking that there's always going to be, somebody at the top trying to transform the political world. But it also shows that there's ways in which the localities can actually fight back, right? We go back to full circles, right? The Bihari Maoists say Delhi, right? For them, it's already, from the bottom to the top in that sense. So I think it's going to be more about like different big cities, Jaipur and Rajasthan or whatever else, right? The big cities are just going to step up. And I think the good news is going to be that there's going to be faster, efficient development because uh, it's less authority from Delhi and it's more authority on the ground, right? So that means you cut the middleman and you can go straight into the policy making and the infrastructure and the capacity building and the whatever else, right? But then the problem is, I think the disadvantage is that it's going to increase the urban and the rural gap as such, right? Because it's not a zero sum game, right? You take power from somewhere, but that means that it's a net loss for another place, right? or it might be a zero-sum game. It depends how you read it, right? If it is a zero-sum game, right, more power to the cities means less power to Delhi, means less power to the rural areas, right? So,
Yep.
um, I mean, I think that's inevitable, right? I mean, look at the Electoral College and the noise it makes in the United States between the urban and the rural, right? I mean, it only happens every 4 years when the debate is interesting, right? But it's still a lot
Mm.
of noise when it happens, right?
Yep.
So same can go for India, right? I mean, I think just these big cities are going to end up doing their own thing and not listening to Delhi, especially after Modi ji is leaving and whatever else, and
Mm.
yeah. You don't
So
need to protest if you don't all depend on the same authority. I think that's how they dodge the problem, right? If different cities have different expectations and they don't need any sort of, federal approval to get it done, that's it.
mm, I think it's just like uh, more than anything, I think it is the central governments which need these cities more than anything because that's critical for them to create the all the money that they want to, so that they could come back to power again and again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's only because of taxes, right? And right? I mean, given what we spoke earlier about the billionaires and the whatever else, right? I mean, they're never the federal, spaces in Delhi are never going to have such, coercion or capacity to convince these private states to do whatever they want, because they can say,
Mm.
okay, fine, we're not going to do business in India anymore. They're just going to take the money and do the business somewhere else because they
Yeah.
have the capital and the resources.
Yep.
They can always turn around and say if Modi ji doesn't like it, that's fine. And go to countries eastward or westward, put more money in Sri Lanka, put more money in Nepal, UAE, whatever, right? So
Yeah.
the corporations don't have the same kind of patriotic devotion to the
Correct.
country that the federal government has. It right.
Right.
It's like this is a I need you, you don't need me kind of mentality, right? The private sector
Yeah.
doesn't need Delhi. Delhi needs the private sector in that sense,
That's right.
and the private
That's
sector can turn around at any point. I mean, there's the Gurgaon also, right, which is next to Delhi. Also, if Gurgaon can also change and be like, okay, we don't want this Delhi nonsense anymore, and they'll just make Haryana grow, and then Delhi is not going to be able to change that. There's nothing
mm,
that. What is Modi going to do if Gurgaon wants to channel more money in their state and less money into Delhi? Right? I mean, they'll pay their taxes, and they make so much money that those taxes are not really that significant, right? I mean, I don't think you've ever read anything on the news of like, oh, Google complains about how heavily they've been taxed. Even when there's those European court cases, Google gets fined 200 million euros. Fine, they pay the 200 million euros and then they walk away. You don't see Google protesting or changing its face or changing its environment or its customers or its
mm,
policies because right. So they're just gonna do their thing. That's why I think that
yep.
once these cities realize that the dependency relationship is asymmetrical and it only goes one way from Delhi to them and not the other way around, they'll just pay their fees to keep Delhi happy and then just build their cities however they want to, right? That's I think Pune is already doing that. Think about it, right? Or like, oh, Pune is so nice and it's so green and it's not as polluted as the rest of India or whatever else, right? Why? It's not like the magic wand from Delhi came to Pune and cleared the sky, right? Right, there's, it's not like Vayu protects specially only Pune and then forgets about the rest of India or something like that, right? There's no kind of miracle over there. It's strictly urban policy that is completely separate from what the federal government wants. And I think that the more Indian cities grow, the more they'll separate from Delhi and they'll have their own thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've talked about the many aspects and the many realities that India faces, India is living currently, and we also talked about the demographic realities, and there will be a time when it is going to change, 2040, let's say for now. So we stand at this juncture, the beginning of 2023, and let's say 15 years from now,
Mm.
all in all, your outlook, you from your knowledge of where India is right now, your outlook, will you say for India, is it more positive or more negative?
I'll give you two of them. I'll give you the optimistic and the pessimistic interpretations both. Delhi goes upwardly, right? First time I was in Delhi was in 2014, actually. I was in India before I came to Nalanda. So I've seen Delhi grow, throughout the last almost 10 years now, right? Next year is going to be 10 years since my first time in Delhi only. And it's only progressed beneficially. I mean, COVID aside, right? Nobody could have done much about COVID. Is Modi still criticizable? Yeah, sure, because he started, 300 million crore building restoration of the Delhi monuments, and the poor people were dying in COVID because they had to work outside. Sure, there's a lot of criticizable things about the pandemic, but in whichever case, the India has grown on an upward trajectory as far as I have seen. Um, I think the trains are also better. The planes are also in decent shape, and the flights are also getting cheaper and cheaper, and domestically in India and whatever else. And you don't hear the problems of Nepal and Sri Lanka and Pakistan trickle down into India. That's partially because India has a good security. That's also partially because India knows how to, take care of themselves more than the neighboring countries know how to take care of themselves. So I think it's fair to say that it's still going to be an upward trajectory, although I really don't think it's going to be the upward trajectory that the BJP is asking. I don't think we're going to have flying saucers and flying Garudas over
Yeah,
India anytime soon in that sense, right? I think there's a long way to go. I think what we
yeah,
spoke about as far as the infrastructure and the development is priority. I'm really curious where this climate science business is going to go with India, because there's a lot of people working in climate science in India, but India is also one of the most polluted states. So I think there's some mentalities that, I mean, not trying to sound like a Westerner or imperialist that imposes like what India should be like, in that sense. But I think that for India's own sake, right, for India's own well-being, I think it's better if there's some substantial reconsideration, reevaluation about what these um, what the climate problem looks like, what the poverty problem looks like, and what the infrastructure problems looks like. I think that those are like the key features that have to change to increase the progress in the fastest way, right? I mean, yes, the gender problems are important. Yes, the whatever else, they matter, right? I mean, they're visible problems. Yes, religion discrimination exists in India, whatever else, but it doesn't bat an eye if you don't have clean air, clean oxygen, and good roads, and
yeah,
secure borders, and then whatever else, right? So I think that first and foremost, Indians need to eat. Honestly, this problem needs to be resolved. Yeah, the pessimistic outlook would be, um, I mean, there's a few possibilities, right? Maybe somebody crazier than Modi takes power and the BJP is on
yeah,
a rolling stone, right? I mean, there's no reason to believe that after Modi leaves, I mean, his legacy is still going to be here, whether we like it or not. The BJP learned a lot from Modi, from Modi, and Congress didn't learn as much from how to counter Modi, right? Because I mean, think
yeah,
about it. The Americans learned the
yeah,
we had our Trump. We learned a lesson. No, no second term for Trump. Boss will echo, right? We'll take Sleepy Joe. Who cares? Anything is better than that, right? But India hasn't internalized that successfully, right? So giving Modi the freeway, and who knows what the BJP has in store in that sense. I mean, the institutions and the VCs in most universities, not just in Bihar but also in Delhi and,
yeah,
and the South also, they're very BJP heavy, right? It's not only about studying for the sake of studying and research. You have to study for the sake of the BJP agenda. So I think that's a problem, right? We saw the JNU protests. We saw that a good liberal education in India is being challenged by the powers that the BJP has gotten from Modi, right? And I think that's dangerous, right? So unless there's going to be changes in that sense, it's going to be difficult to tell. But pessimistically, also, it can be outside of India, right? I mean, something stupid can happen, US-China relations,
yeah,
like that, right? There's always India's at the crossroads, as you said, between everybody.
yep,
They want the best from everybody, and they want to stay friends with everybody. So I think that might have some negative consequences, right? I think at some point
yeah,
or other, the Chinese are going to stop the tap, or the Americans are going to stop the tap, and then India is going to be forced into making choices that they don't want to make, but they might have
yep,
to, right?
yep,
So I think if anything detrimental happens in India, it's going to be primarily foreign policy related. I don't think anything ridiculous is going to happen, right? If nothing ridiculous happened in 60 years, I don't think in the next 10 or 20 something ridiculous is going to happen. But internationally, there's always something, outside
yeah,
stands or capacities, right? I mean, I don't think Pakistan is going to become more aggressive or something. They're in such a hole right now. They need to build themselves up. I
Yeah,
don't think India has to worry about the Pakistanis either. So yeah, I think that's the pessimistic outlook. BJP continues to push India into more Patel statues and less JNU, and then that kind of backwards mentality that is more detrimental to the Indian folks than they think it is. And I don't think this is like a liberal or a democratic problem at that point, right? I don't think it's about how to say. I mean, well, tampering and altering somebody's right to education and right to information is not an academic
yeah,
problem, right? It's more
yeah,
fundamental than that. So, I mean, the way they politically spin it, I think that's interesting. But I think it's also, it's like if I was, a governor or something in India, I don't want the future generation to be a bunch of idiots. I don't want the future, like, I want to leave my country into the secure hands of capable individuals that are smart, right? It's not in my incentive to create idiots in the future generations, right? You want,
yeah,
right, the genuine incentive of a politician should be to invest in the future in such a way that they don't repeat the lessons of the past. But if you want to keep the clock at 1955 in India, well, that's a problem, right? Because the rest of the world is going to move on, right? And if
yeah,
India already has to play catch up. So if you don't give the youth all the necessary power and capacity and financial incentive to stay in India, right? Then
yeah,
it's doing more harm to the country than it's actually, helping. So
yeah,
hopefully it's going to be on the good side, but there's some things that are maybe not apolitical, but there's some more fundamental kind of questions about these
yeah.
dynamics in the Indian civic space. But yeah, you tell me your prediction for next 10, 15, 20 years.
It's actually very similar to yours.
Mm,
Uh, very, very similar. And I also expect things to be positive rather than negative. And of course, I mentioned also I have my own reservations. But overall, I think the outlook is good. But the reality also is that uh, India cannot control its own destiny in a total sense. Its destiny it heavily depends on what happens outside India as well, and the very delicate balance which uh, India is trying to strike is not going to be easy to sustain if things change in the international world order. So, as you mentioned, it may be forced to make choices which it may not want ideally to make, and it is not going to be easy in that sense. Then all of the problems which are sort of hidden in the background right now might surface, might become more prominent than they are right now. So it's for India, it's like fingers crossed. I think that's what it is. So yeah,
yeah, I mean, the worry is that India has been caught between countries going at each other before. So,
yeah,
yeah, hopefully that's not going to be an issue. But yeah, you see that more and more the news is coming to international chaos and whatever else. And right, I mean, the way Indian security policy works is that you defend yourself, right? India doesn't have an offensive
yeah,
strategy. India has, a
yeah,
measurable good defensive,
yes,
geopolitical strategy, but it doesn't have like some Chinese or American type grand strategy of
right,
universal secure blah blah, right? So it's always,
right,
I mean, I empathize, right, as Romanian also between the Soviets and the whatever else. We've had our fair share, our historical fair share of being caught between the arms of others and whatever else. So,
right.
yeah. Would you like to wrap it up here, or you want to keep
Yes,
going?
I
We're good here.
no, I think I would like to wrap it up. I would want to thank you very much for having me for the chat. It was a lovely chat. I think we covered a good amount of area in terms of the space as well as the time that we talked about. I think it was very nice.
Yeah. Great conversation, man. It was good to have you. We'll see you around.
Okay, thank you. See
Yeah.
you then.
Yeah. Ciao. Take care. Bye.